Hello and welcome to another edition of Should Have Listened to My Mother. I'm your host, Jackie Tantillo. When I think of today's guest, I usually picture her surrounded by kids, whether they're her own children, her neighbors' kids, her children's friends, her foster children, you name it. There's kids usually everywhere. It's kind of like the Pied Piper. She's also a grandmother. You'd never know it. Doesn't look it, a wife and an attorney, and has published several articles regarding injustices in juvenile prosecutions, racism, and more. The Legal Aid Society of New York is a large, private, not-for-profit legal services organization which believes that no New Yorker should be denied access to justice because of poverty. My guest was the attorney in charge of the New York Legal Aid Society, the Juvenile Rights Division, for over 11 years. She oversaw well over 300 staff, representing more than 34,000 cases a year, and she was also the chief operating officer for 2 years at the Legal Aid Society. Please welcome Tammy Steckler to Should Have Listened to My Mother.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. So Tammy is a friend. We met because her husband was a baseball coach. So we have this history of a couple of years on baseball fields, and then slowly but surely, because you're usually concentrating on your kids and what's going on in that whole thing with school and friends and all that, and then you gradually get to figure out what the parents do in their real life when they don't have their mom or dad hat on.
Which is you never don't have that hat on.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's maybe overcome by other things occasionally, but it's always on.
And you have several mother hats or mom hats, and this is kind of the journey that I want to take us on now, because I have never met anybody that has done what you have done, not only for your own family, but for so many kids out there, and find out who you are today, who or what shaped you, and the involvement, the role that your mom had in your life. Now, we spoke the other day, and you actually brought me to tears when you were telling me a story about your mom, and that's totally legit. And I hope that we can share that story again today, because that's the kind of stuff that not only helps one another, it just helps mom. It helps women to understand that we all go through this stuff every day, right? This emotional struggle, especially in this line of work when you're dealing with kids who have nothing at times. The emotional stress and strain must be overwhelming for you.
Right. Well, I've always had this feeling that the older I get and the more I mother, the more I understand my mother. And most importantly, the more I understand what that relationship entails. Because when you have children, I don't think, despite the fact that people have probably told you so, I don't believe you completely understand that connection, the mother-child connection. And it could be, as you've mentioned, it could be with, I have an adopted son, it could be with him, it could be with my biological children, with the foster children through my home, or even some children who lived in my home through none of those three means. But that connection, that mother connection, is almost, I think, indescribable. It's so complicated. And I think as I get older, I'm nearing 60, I'm only beginning to understand just how complicated that relationship is with your children. And that, quite frankly, you never stop parenting. My oldest child is almost 40. He'll be 40 in a few weeks. And, even though it's not day-to-day parenting, certainly you remain a resource for your children in a very special way. And also the worry that you feel and the desire for your children to be happy and whole and productive, that feeling doesn't change the older your kids get. That feeling actually remains weirdly the same as when they were little.
Oh, so, gosh.
Yeah, I think parenting is forever, and more
so
than I
true.
thought many, many years ago when I started the parenting journey, the mothering journey, I started very young.
At 18, man, 18 you can go to war, you can drive, you can smoke cigarettes, all that kind of stuff.
It's all crazy to me.
It's ridiculous. The 21 is an adult. That's even kind of ridiculous. Right? You can't put a number on anything. But here we are, and we've fallen into this role. Please tell us your mom's name before we go any further.
My mom's name is Ferne.
Ferne.
Ferne with an E, yes.
Oh, I've never heard that before. That's a good one. And tell us a little bit about, you grew up on Long Island, right?
I grew up on Long Island, filled with white privilege, in a very wealthy, Jewish community. I was raised Jewish. And my mom was sort of, I'm going to say, an odd man out. My parents were separated early on, but divorced when I was a teenager. So I was raised with my father, I'm going to say, in and out until I was my early teens. And but really, I feel like I was raised by my mom, mostly. So she was a single mom for large parts of that time. But she wasn't your typical suburban mom. My mom had a lot of interests outside the home. She was an amazing cook, to the extent that I think when I think of her, mostly what I think of in a lot of ways is being in the kitchen with her and smelling her food and eating her food.
That's great.
Yeah, she was really one of those can go into the fridge without an idea and come out and cook, one of the most amazing meals you'll ever eat. And I had not inherited that skill set. I think mostly because she was doing it all the time. And if my mother was in the house, you wouldn't want me to cook. You would want her to cook.
What were some of your favorites? Do you remember?
Oh, yeah. She, very big soup maker. She loved to make soups, thick, hearty soups, mushroom barley soup, beet soup. She made an amazing brisket. She made a dish that we at home called chicken Camille. It was really like a chicken marsala in a lot of ways. There were so many. She was immensely talented at cooking, which was sort of interesting to me because she also had a career and was my mother was very, very involved in politics and current events, in sort of the movements of her time, the LGBT movement, the women's movement.
And this was when?
So I'm going to say 60s, 70s, even 80s. Really, before the LGBT movement was a movement for people other than LGBT people. She was very, very involved. And I, she, first of all, let me start by saying she probably, to this day, is one of the most brilliant people that I've known in my life. So bright and smart and articulate.
Was she an attorney?
She became an attorney in her 40s. She did not start out an attorney. In the beginning, when I was younger, she was at home, but she soon went to work in various jobs. She worked in the Girl Scout administration for a while. She ran for public office several times when I was growing up. Eventually, she went to law school and had a law practice.
What kind of law?
She did family law, divorces, custody, visitation, orders of protection. She was, very into women's rights. She was in the very beginning of the women's rights movement at the time when Gloria Steinem was involved in Bella Abzug. She was very, she used to cart me around. We would go to Albany for, I'm sure at the time, although I don't remember specifically, it's for legislative issues to try to change some of the laws related to women's issues. So she, very early on, I think all of my siblings and I, but particularly me, sort of was very sort of impacted by her politicism, by the fact that she was involved and felt very engaged in what was going on around her, and that's lived with me my whole life. I'm similar to that. But she was also very social justice oriented. My mother was a big believer in equality and equity, and did a lot of work around those issues as well, which completely impacted me. I would say was probably the foundation for what I ultimately did for a career and the way I live my life.
Advocating for the disadvantaged, not only children but women, right? It started at an early age. Would you sit around and discuss her cases or law when you were young?
No, I would say not really her law. By the time she had me in her early 20s, so by the time she became a lawyer, I was in college. So a lot of what I had thought and felt was really sort of deep inside me already by that point. It had sort of been bred in me. And it was a little odd. My mom, our house was very much a gathering spot for lots of people that were sort of fighting for their rights and fighting for issues. My mother was very involved, and we'd have a lot of meetings in our house and conversations, and I was peripherally involved in those conversations. I knew they were happening. Sometimes I was more involved than other times, but I knew certainly politics is something we discussed at our dinner table. It was something that my siblings and I knew a lot about, the current world. And it's interesting because when you grow up, you don't really understand completely your own experience, right? It's your experience. It's what you live through. And you could see, like I could tell my mom was different than my friends' moms, right? She looked different. She was, just always dressed to the nines, beautiful, current, in a way that a lot of the moms weren't. And certainly out and about more. And I knew that was different. I knew she was more engaged in the outside world than a lot of the other moms were. But until I got older and could look back, I didn't quite understand it all. It didn't quite make sense to me until I was much older. And I think that, you mentioned my house being sort of this open place. That definitely exists because that was my mom's house.
Ah, so you...
everyone always landed in my mom's house.
Oh, that's amazing. Often people will do the antithesis of how they were raised. This is something you're so passionate about, and it's in your heart and your soul. So you wanted to continue, you wanted to go down this same path, right?
I mean, the truth is I think you don't sometimes, there are things I definitely do different than my mom because I didn't care for them. Like my mom was always late, hours late, everywhere. And I am painfully on time everywhere because it used to bother me. She was late all the time, but it was her MO. She was just always late. So there are definitely things that I think you look at as a child and you say, well, when I have my own family, I'm going to do that differently. But the truth is, my upbringing was strange. It certainly wasn't traditional in a lot of ways. And I find myself, sort of moving in a certain way. And sometimes I don't even think it's conscious. I think it's just sort of muscle memory. It's what your body knows and what your mind knows. So having a lot of people in my house is a place of comfort for me. I like that. And certainly I'm sure that the reason I like that, someone once said to my sister when she was visiting, she lives in Europe, your sister is so comfortable in chaos. And I feel like that was bred into me. My home was sort of like that. It was always people moving in and out and things happening and conversations, right? It wasn't this traditional 9 to 5 that comes home, sit at the table, have dinner, everybody retires to the dead and watches a show and goes to sleep. It was very different than that. And I think that gets bred into you the same way other things do.
How many siblings do you have?
So I have 3 that I grew up with, older brother, younger sister, and I have 2 half-siblings that I didn't grow up with. They were through my dad.
So what's chaos to one is comfort to another. It all depends on where your heart is and what your passions are. So for your children, is this their norm now that they've grown up with your home full of foster kids? And we'll get to that in a minute. Are your children comfortable with everyone being at your house?
Well, it's interesting. I would say for each of my kids, my kids are very far apart in age. I have an almost 40-year-old who's married and has a child. I have a 27-year-old who's engaged and lives with his fiancée in Long Island, and I have an 18-year-old. And I would say each one probably was impacted slightly. It's interesting. Each one of their friends groups, so my oldest, my middle, my youngest, all hung out at our house. Our house was a house that people hang out in. And so each one, I will say not only did their friends hang out when they were younger, but each one had friends who lived with us at some point. So my oldest son had friends who lived with us. My middle son definitely had friends who lived with us at some point, and not Avery because he's youngest. But I would say that my 2 oldest sons enjoyed the people around us tremendously, but probably lived quieter lives. So especially my middle son prefers that sometimes the chaos would get to him and he would remove himself from the chaos. So he would go upstairs to his room and close the door, but sometimes the chaos would, I think, get to him. My oldest is more easygoing, and I don't think it really bothered him, the in and out. And my youngest remains to be seen. He's very connected to all the people that come in and out of our house. But it remains to be seen sort of how he chooses as he's older to live, whether he chooses that same sort of environment. I don't know.
Your children don't even have to be home for all of the friends to be at your house.
No, it's kind of
it's
always
a
been
haven,
that way.
right?
Yeah.
And that's just incredible. It is so important for any child. Some kids, they have a place where they know they can go, and there's no judgment. There's nothing. It's just, let's go. and I've known that for a very, very long time, and that's very, very cool. I think that's really, really neat. When did you decide to go to law school?
So I was a teacher for 2 years when I got out of college, which made sense.
Teaching what?
I taught actually really developmentally disabled kids in a school in Queens, New York, and I knew that I would do something related to kids. I've always had, for some reason, a very strong connection to kids. I've always felt that that's what I want to do for a living, and particularly kids that are lower income or more disadvantaged in some way. So teaching seemed natural to me. I didn't know that there were a lot of other options actually to do something with kids. That seemed like the best way, and I loved it. I actually still think there's nothing better than teaching at all. I loved that experience. But at some point I got frustrated with some of the problems that I saw at the school related to services for the kids and resources and kids that I didn't think belonged in the special school that they were in and should have been and then some inclusion classes in a mainstream school. So I decided to go to law school. My mom was a lawyer by that point. She had already gone to law school, or she was in law school. No, maybe she had graduated by then. And both my brothers, my older brother and my younger brother, had gone to law school. One was still in, one was out. So I was the fourth person to go.
Wow.
And I would have sworn, on a stack of, I'm Jewish, I'll say Torahs, that I would have sworn that I would never have gone to law school. It had no interest for me. And I really went to do a particular kind of advocacy, which was child advocacy. And family advocacy. I wouldn't be a lawyer and would never have been a lawyer in any other venue. I would have done something else. So I feel very fortunate that I went to law school and I was able to sort of find my way into the exact work that I wanted to do.
Well, it certainly seems working with kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
It seems like you found your right path, as far as I'm concerned, because I've seen the work that you do and the effect that you have on kids. So before we talk about families that you fostered, I read an article from New York Magazine from 1991, and I believe this is about your godson. Was this about Jermaine? Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
So that, I'm going to say, was one of the worst things that occurred in my life. Which was, it's one of those kind of weird stories. Sometimes it's almost embarrassing to tell, but in some ways it's beautiful. And I credit my mother with a lot of what I'm about to say, which is she was a single mom, and when I was 10 and we moved, she had a woman come and live with us and help her. And that woman ended up taking tremendous care of us, obviously. While that woman was living with us, her name is Ernestine, she's still living, she gave birth to a child. And my mom, because my house was very much like my house now, very open, my mom said to her, just stay here with him. You can just stay here and live here with him. So his name is Jermaine, and he lived with us in our house for a few years until his sister was born, and then they moved out. But my family, but myself in particular, stayed very, very close to Ernestine and those two kids who are now grown adults. And that relationship is probably one of the most important relationships in my life, and all sort of bred through my mother's ability to connect and care and open her heart and her home to Ernestine. And I'd say Ernestine they were probably about 10 years apart in age, my mom and Ernestine. But together, they sort of raised the four of us, and then we sort of obviously stayed in contact, and I was very connected to her kids. And, we're not related by blood, but I feel as related to those children as I do to people I'm blood related to. And my oldest son, Michael, who's almost 40, and Ernestine's oldest son, Jermaine, who's 45, and her daughter, who's at 43, I want to say, 42, they grew up together. They sort of did everything together. So they very much see themselves as siblings, the three of them. But anyway, Jermaine, when he was in high school, he was going into 12th grade. He was at the end of his junior year, actually. He was brutally beaten up with bats by a bunch of, he's black, by a bunch of white kids, one from a local kid and the others from from Bayside, Queens, and it was terrible. He was in a coma. They were talking about organ donation. One of his friends called me. I ran to the hospital. I met his mother there. We were talking to the doctors, and they were really talking about organ donation. They didn't think he was going to live, and they decided to do brain surgery, a particular doctor, and saved his life. But when he came out of that surgery, he was in a coma, unable to move 3 of his limbs at all, and it was in the press. It was first of all, it was in the press because it was sort of, at the time thought to be sort of, it was actually a race-related issue. And so it was very much in the press at the time. And the fast forward, the good news is Jermaine's still with us and just turned 45, and he's, an amazing kid. But I went through all of that with Ernestine. The two of us flew to rehab. I was pregnant, actually, with my middle son, but we flew to rehabs together to try to pick a good rehab for him. I was in the hospital with her every day. I had taken a leave from work. So that story is the story, basically, of Jermaine's recovery. It was his story, but he actually lived, and actually there was a trial. All those boys except one went to jail. And we move on. That was a lot of years ago. I can't believe how many years ago that was. So it feels like yesterday.
Jermaine was destined to do great things in football and everything. Can he walk? Can he talk? More or less fully recovered?
Oh, he is. Yeah. If physically, he's pretty good. Yeah. I mean, he's got like some small things, I think, that sort of go back to what happened to him. But it took him a while, more mentally than physically, to sort of move through it. But yes, he's miraculously with us, and that was not supposed to be the case. So, yeah. But it definitely solidified my family's closeness to that family, because we went through it very much together in a lot of ways, and it's overwhelming for me too. Quite honestly, it took me a good 2 years to sort of be able to breathe again. Because Jermaine, to me, it was like one of my children. I felt about him. He was probably the first child. He was born when I was 14 into my home, my mom's home, and I loved him. I loved him like a mother loves a child. We're only 14 years apart, but that's very much, our relationship is very much like that. It's not a peer relationship. It's very much like a parenting relationship, and yeah, I was devastated when this happened, and really was on autopilot in every way, complete autopilot, just to get through it and hope that he would recover, and he did. It was much obviously harder for his mom, who went through a really hard time when that happened. But he's here, he's with us, and he's a pretty incredible guy. So
that's a wonderful story. Oh my gosh, if we should all be so lucky to have a result like that. Obviously, it was traumatic and horrific, but thank God he pulled it off. This is a miracle that he made it through this. That was just one story that I read. I remember it in the news, but to reread that story last night was pretty intense. So, my gosh, it's like a puzzle. They all seem to be fitting together. Your relationship with your mom, and you doing what you have done so successfully all these years, and then you take not only one foster family into your home, but 2. Can you tell us how that all fit into place?
Yeah, so years ago when my husband, when we were first married and I was working at Legal Aid, we became certified foster parents in New York. and we took in a few kids, and those were clients that I had represented, adolescent clients that had nowhere to go. So that was our first sort of stab at it. But I really, really wanted to take in these clients, and I left legal aid in order to do that. And we actually, the first family we took in was a local family that was having problems. And, you know, when I became, obviously I've worked in the foster care field my whole career, so I was pretty sure I wanted to do fostering slightly differently than fostering is normally done. And I wanted to take adolescents, sibling groups, and I wanted to connect to the parents. You know, I didn't want to sort of seem like this isolated family that was taking care of somebody else's child, because I know how, you know, first of all, most bio parents whose kids are in foster care or birth parents, you know, it's just usually an issue of either poverty or inability to get yourself out of a bad situation because of lack of resources. The majority of kids in foster care are there through sort of, I'm going to call it more benign neglect. It's it's poverty. It's parents who don't have enough resources or overstressed, right? I don't think it's not this type of abuse that you think about when you think of foster care. So I knew that when the kids were coming into my home, I needed to connect to the parents, and that to the extent possible, I wanted to try to help the parents get the kids back home. Because the truth is, after working in foster care and adoption for so many years, most kids want to go home. They want to be with their biological family. If not their parents, then their extended families. So when we went into it with this notion that we were going to try to connect these kids, keep them connected with their families while they were with us, and I was going to try to help the parents to gain access back to their kids. And so the first family, that was the sole goal, was to create an environment and help their mom get the help she needed so that they can go back. And those kids went back in a year, back to their mom, and they've been with their mom ever since, and they're doing great. And to me, they're a real success story just generally. They're really, she's raised some exceptionally great kids. And, you know, because I wanted to do it differently, I do visitation in my home. I would I still do allow the bio parents to come into my home and visit with their children, and often, you know, I'll leave for a little bit and allow them some time to themselves, so that I'm not constantly there. You know, to the extent that I could. A lot of these moms are young, much younger than me. You know, some of them 30 years younger than me, and so to the extent I can help mentor these moms, you know, that's what I do. I sort of just, a lot of them come to me to ask me parenting questions, but I keep an eye just to sort of say, is there a way I can assist them in developing a relationship with their children? And then the other part of it is, how can I assist them to get these children back home where they probably should be?
That's fantastic, right, if that could work.
Right.
So tell us, the kids that you were fostering, when my son and your son were playing, and your husband, who's a saint and I adore, they were playing baseball. So we had an opportunity to meet 4 more kids.
Right. That was the next family we
How wonderful. The whole community got to meet these children. It was just brilliant. It was so natural and just opened everyone's eyes.
Yeah, it was a great opportunity. I mean, this family is a family, you know, that we're still very close to. It's a family of 10 kids. When we had 4 of those kids in our care, there were 8 of them. Now there's 10 of them. And we had 4 adolescent girls who took me for quite a ride initially. And then we had their brother, a little boy. At the time he was 3. Now he just turned 9. But that family was really interesting because, our community became really close to that family. And you couldn't help with the 3-year-old. Everybody knows him. I feel like he's almost much a part of our community as if he'd been living here for the last 6 years. You know, everybody knows nothing. And he very much that whole family has a big place in my heart. But he very much has a big place in my heart. And they were with us for a while their mom, who was very young, took care of some issues that she was having, and they went back home as well. You know, when those kids first came in, those girls were very, very angry. They didn't want to be in care, and I think it was interesting for our community, people in our community, to realize, I think there's this frame of reference that if kids are growing up in the projects in Newark, that to be in a house in Maplewood, like a white picket fence house, would be awesome. Like, who wouldn't want that, right? We have so many more things than their family had. But the truth is, kids don't really care an awful lot about those things when they're not with their family. You know, those girls wanted to be home. They wanted to be with their mom. They wanted to be with their own family. And I think that's the part that people don't understand. And it was interesting for, a lot of people in our community would say to me, well, why are they so unhappy? And they're in your home, and isn't it great? And I said, yes, but I'm not their mom. You know, I'm a stranger. They were taken out of their home and put in a stranger's home. And imagine if that was your children.
You want to go home.
That's right. They want to go home, and your parents are your parents. And so we worked really hard with their mom to get them home, and they did go home. But the way it should work, I think, worked, which is we became sort of a mentoring family to their whole family. We've connected now to all the kids, not just the 4 we had, and I'm connected to the mom and speak to her regularly. We take those kids a lot on holidays and weekends to give her some respite, which I think is helpful so she can get a breather. And, we offer those kids also some respite, I think. Sometimes the big girls want to get away from their crowded house, and they come and they just lay on my couch and watch movie after movie after movie with a blanket wrapped around them. Sometimes they need the respite too. So, that's the way I think foster care should look. Hopefully one day it will, because it works. I think when you do it that way, you have to go in with absolutely no judgment.
I think that's tremendous, and I don't know if everyone can get to the place where you are with that level of understanding, and they're going to have good days and bad days, right? Just like we do.
Right. Well, you and I spoke about this, that when I was younger, I had a lot of opinion about how people were parenting, that there was a right way, and, maybe I was doing it right and somebody else wasn't. But, the older you get, the more you realize the truth is that all parenting is just a crapshoot. And you literally put in everything you think is right, and you could be 100% wrong, and boom, your kids come out the way they come out. And the truth is, I know this to be true because I have seen kids who have had unbelievably traumatic upbringings. This is my work. And yet succeed in ways I could only wish for my kids to succeed. And it doesn't make sense, right? Because if you think about what those kids have gone through and the traumas that they've experienced, why they should be able to move through life and be successful doesn't really make a whole lot of sense sometimes. But the truth is, resilience is an interesting thing, right? Some kids really have a lot of resilience and are able to build on that resilience.
Kids more than adults are resilient, right? They just keep getting up.
They keep getting up, and I think we undervalue. I think this happens a lot with kids in general. And, when in representing kids for so many years, people would always say to me, well, they don't know what they want. Why do you let them control their cases? And I like to say the truth is most kids do know what they want. They don't have a lot of experience, but the truth is if you listen, they actually know a lot more about their own lives than you want to give them credit for. They actually understand a lot more about their families than you want to give them credit for. And it doesn't really make a difference if they're right or wrong, because truthfully, I don't even, the older I get, the more I realize there is no right or wrong. There's really no right or wrong. I mean, certainly you shouldn't beat your children to, that I think is clear. But all the other nuances of parenting and mothering, there's so many different ways to do it, and the truth is you could do it as successfully as you think you can, right? You think you're doing everything right. Buy the book, you buy the books, and you read them. And you do it just like the books say. And in the end, it doesn't make a difference.
Yeah, it doesn't. And everyone's different and every child's different. Hopefully we all will be lucky enough that our kids will have a long and fulfilling life, right? And happiness as well.
Yeah, and I think the hardest part about mothering, and I actually think my mother did this well, and I think I do it less well than my mom. I think the part about parenting that's hardest is the letting go, and not just physically letting go, which I think, for me has been very painful to physically let go of my kids, but the letting go of any notion that you have about what your child's life should be, right? Because that notion is the damaging thing, right? When you have a plan for your child and that plan isn't happening, right, it's very easy to just, look, parents sometimes know best, and I'm not saying they don't. I think often I do know best. But the truth is that every kid has their own journey, and they have to have it. And that's how they learn, and that's how they grow. And I'm bad at that. I'm bad at letting my kids have their own journey. I want to be involved in every little piece of it. But the truth is, I'm learning. It's good because my youngest is now 18. I've learned a little late, but I've learned that that journey doesn't have to look the way I think it should, and it could still end up okay.
How did your mom handle situations like that? Was she free to let you choose the direction you wanted?
Yeah, my mom actually was really good at this part, in part because my mom, she was very young when she got married and had kids like most of our parents at that time. And, I think a lot of her life, she was really just starting to live her life after having 4 kids, right? But I think that she was very, very good. I never really felt pushed in any direction. I think the thing my mother gave me that was most valuable was the confidence really to do whatever I wanted to do, that I was smart enough and able enough and capable enough to just follow any path and achieve. And that, to me, is actually, that's the key, right? Because once you give a kid that feeling that they can go anywhere and do anything, then that kid will go anywhere and do anything, right? They'll get where they need to be. And she was a pretty hands-off parent in that way. And I feel like she did that better than me. I feel like I was much more connected or invested in my kids' path than my mom was in mine. I allow my kids a lot of freedom, but my son called me when he's 27 now, so 10 years ago, he called me a compulsive intervener, which I thought was both the best and worst insult I'd ever received in my life. I thought he was going to call me an asshole, so I was happy. I was happy that compulsive intervener was what came out of his mouth. But
oh my gosh, from the mouths of babes as a teenager.
Yeah, and
right?
I realized, that's pretty much what I was. And my mom was not that. My mom was not a compulsive intervener.
Did you see your mom vulnerable at many times, any time?
Well, as I told you, my mom, I didn't see her that way growing up. There was a lot of issues around my mom, and I believe her mental health that were not treated. But I didn't see her as vulnerable. I actually saw my mother as really powerful. And I would call my mother for everything. I would call her for, big problems. But I would also call her because, actually, I was married very young initially and divorced, which is where my first son, that's where he came from. And I remember cooking. I was in my early 20s, and I was cooking in my apartment, and I roasted chicken. And I cut into the chicken, and I thought that I had discovered the first chicken with all dark meat, no white meat. And I called my mother. I'm like, oh, my God, I roasted this chicken, and it's an all dark meat chicken. And she said, honey, turn the chicken over. You're cutting on the underside. The breast is on the other side. And I flipped the chicken and cut into the breast. It was white meat. But, gosh. She was always very patient and sort of kind about those kinds of things with me. I remember once as a kid, I wore a shirt of hers I wasn't supposed to wear. I used to steal her clothes constantly. And I got a stain on it, and I washed it, but I put bleach in to clean the stain at my friend's house. And, of course, there was white splotches all over it. And I called her, and I said, Mom, you're going to be so mad. I took a shirt of yours, and I got, some stain on it. And she said, oh, when you washed it with bleach and it's all white? I'm like, how do you know that? It's like that omnipresent mother knowledge. But my mom never made a big deal about anything like that. She was always very low-key about mistakes. She was very sort of accepting.
Did your mom used to give marital advice?
No. Well, my mom, she had a couple of marriages and relationships, so not really. She definitely had opinions about who we married and those relationships. But like most things, who listens? Got married when I was very young. I'm sure she didn't want me to get married that young. That marriage ended up obviously falling apart. The good news is I got Michael, my oldest son, out of that marriage, so yay, it was worth it. And my mom, when I left that marriage, she took me in with Michael. And, Michael was not my biological son. So she's always been like that. I called her. I said, I got to get out of here. I got to move. She came. My mom was always a mobilizer. She got the moving truck. We packed. She got us out. And she took Michael in, and she loved Michael as much as I loved Michael, and took us in, and we lived with her until I moved out a couple of years later. But, she's always been that way. My mom has always sort of had this, openness to her. And the truth is, I never really felt very judged by my mom, about what I was doing and how I was doing it. I could tell when she was unhappy with me. She thought I wasn't doing something that was good for myself, but she was always there. I always felt like I could rely on her. Towards the end of her life, the last 10 years, she sort of unwound. And I think her mental health got the best of her finally, and she ended up moving in with me and my husband.
And then the roles reversed. You took care of her.
The roles reversed in a pretty awful way, yeah.
I'm so sorry.
In a pretty awful way. But she's been deceased for 12 years, almost 13 years. And the truth is it's funny how that happened, right? I mean, it's all those negative feelings that had occurred over those last 10 years that were really difficult for her and I. What I remember most are all the good things. Right now, I find myself at the stove trying to recreate all her flavors, right? My mother never cooked by recipe. She just wasn't a recipe person. Because when you're talented at cooking, you don't need that. But I work to create those flavors for myself again, so I could taste them, or those smells, and I find myself thinking mostly about the good stuff, about all the things I miss about her and all the good things, because there were a lot of good years. The last 10 years were really, really difficult. I mean, the last 10 years, I will say, the saving grace of the last 10 years is that even in all my mother's sort of decline, she was always incredibly close to my children and very loving to my children. And my middle son, he's an insomniac like I am, and he would wake up in the middle of the night, and I would hear the patter of little feet when she was living with me, and he would be going into her room, and I would hear them. He would go into her bed with her, and they would just sit and chat. My middle one has a very active mind. He thinks about a lot all the time, and they would just chat about everything. He loved astronomy. They would talk about the stars and planets, and I would hear her just up in the middle of the night with him, providing comfort to him, chatting with him until he could fall asleep. And, it was good because it reminded me during a very bad time with her and I about what I loved about her, because that's who she was for me when I was that age in a lot of ways. I found her very much a comfort for me, even in all the craziness. And so it reminded me. It was good because it was a rough relationship in those 10 years. And so it was a little thing in my head that said, this is who she is. This person in this bed was my, 9-year-old.
That's the mom you remember.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a beautiful story. That's beautiful. Now, you shared a story with me the other day, and I don't know if you want to talk about it again, when you were so busy at Legal Aid Society and you went to see your mom in the hospital, I think.
Yeah, so my mom became pretty ill, and I don't think we believed. She ended up on dialysis, and she ended up in the hospital, which was ultimately with cancer. And she wasn't, there was no sense that she was going to die, but she was sick. And I had just started my job at Legal Aid, and I was really struggling with her. I mean, I think a lot of people have this experience, and I think actually as a community in a world, we don't talk about it enough, which is, there comes a time when your parents age or get sick where you flip, and you really become the parent. And you start to caretake your parent in a way that feels like you're parenting your parent. And it is unnatural. And actually, this is the part that people don't talk about. The unnatural part I've read about. But there's also an anger associated with it. Like, I felt angry. And not that I had, it didn't make sense to me. First of all, my mom was young. She was only 69 when she died. But I just felt like I don't want to parent my parent. I want my parent to parent me. That's what feels right. This feels wrong. But it happens, right? Because your parents deteriorate either through age or illness or one way or the other, and you take care of your parents, right? I felt very much that was right. My mom wasn't doing well, and I needed to take care of her. And but it erodes a connection. I mean, maybe you could develop another connection, but it erodes the one that was there. And so I had just started a job at Legal Aid. She was in the hospital. It was just a couple of days before she died. I didn't know that, obviously. I'd gone into therapy a couple of years before because I was really angry with her for the way she was living her life and sort of impacting my life and not taking care of herself, and I was frustrated. And I went into therapy to try to work through that anger and so that I could just be supportive to her. And the therapist kept saying to me, you have to turn the table back. In some way, you have to let her parent you. You can't keep it this way because that's the fiction. You need to let her parent you. Find a way that she could still do that. And I couldn't do it. I just didn't know how to do it, and she was in such a bad space mentally and physically. I just couldn't figure it out. But I'd go to work, I'd work all day, and then I'd drop my stuff at home, and I'd go to the hospital to sit by her bedside while she was very sick, and I was exhausted. And I put my head down on the railing. She was in the bed on the railing, just out of sheer exhaustion, and she started to stroke my hair. And in that second, it occurred to me, like, this is it, right? She's parenting me. And it felt so natural and normal again. And I realized I had not had that feeling in a long time with her, where she had parented me. But here she was. I was exhausted. She recognized it, and she was stroking my hair to comfort me and to say it's okay. And, you know, it was like the light bulb went off, the big ding. You know, like, this is what he's talking about because this feels right. And then she died 2 days later, so
oh my gosh.
Whatever epiphany I had was short-lived.
The second time hearing that story, and it still brings tears to my eyes, because sometimes we just need that. No matter how old we are, we just need to know that someone is still taking care of us. And it's usually a mother-daughter.
It's almost always a mother.
Yeah,
you know?
it's something
it's almost
special.
Always a mother.
My guest, Tammi Steckler. I can't thank you enough for all that you do, and now you're on a journey to find out what your next chapter, a new beginning. That's exciting. And hopefully we get to have you back on Should Have Listened to My Mother to find out what you're up to next, because you do really good stuff.
Well, thanks so much. It's kind of cathartic to talk about it all. So you were like my therapy session for this morning. Thank you.
There's so much to talk about, and there's so much to share. And that's how we all learn. That's the point of being here, is to help one another. I'm Jackie Tantillo. Thanks for listening to Should Have Listened to My Mother.